I think we still got 2 minutes, so talk amongst yourself. Maybe they took Karen's car somewhere. Does it? Oh, I mean, it could. Has he? I had a period of time where I felt like I was having a flat tire. I get to the point I had a double blowout, and yeah, 2 tires. Yeah. I got to the curb, and so and at that point I started packing 2 spares, so 2 donuts. So and and I still pack a full floor jack. I don't do the little. So for the little extra room to have a floor jack. It's listen. Every time I think it's good, then it starts flaring up on me, and yeah, I probably should schedule a follow up appointment with the doctor. So that'll be another 6 months, I'm sure. It's just the way they book out, or it won't. Yeah. Well, it is about that time, so we will go ahead and get us started. All right. So we started talking last week about the role of deacons within the church. Deacons is another one of the appointed positions within the local body. Deacons are the word deacon or deaconos means servant. Um, and we're going to talk about in a moment how that can potentially be a little bit confusing. But we got to talking about in 1 Timothy 3 the various qualifications of a deacon. So turn back over there and take a look. For a second. And there's a lot of similarities between the requirements for deacons and requirements for elders. Effectively, they need to be serving in that capacity. They must be tested first, is what the text says. But the idea is you don't just put somebody in a position and hope they figure it out. I knew a congregation one time that, put men in positions as deacons and just hoped for the best, and that rarely ever worked out. Wasn't a good situation. But again, it comes back to the being sober-minded, being dignified. They need to be the kind of people of good standing. They also are the husband of one wife, the same as an elder, and then they must manage their children and their household well. The distinction there is it does not say that their children must be believers in the same way that it does for elders. So that would mean then that a deacon can have younger children and still serve in the role of deacon. They'll be exhausted, but that's all right. And normally your deacons are younger, but that's not always the case. I've known deacons in their 40s on up through their 80s. It's more about the attitude. That is what is important. And so verse 13, I think, of 1 Timothy 3 really gives the kind of summation. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. And we frequently within the church, we have made the pipeline for leadership. Someone becomes a Christian, they're a member, they serve and volunteer in various ways, and then they become a deacon, and then they become an elder. So it's kind of it's a progression. It's very much how we think of like a corporate, right? You come in at your entry level, then maybe you become a supervisor and a manager, and then on up the chain. But the reality is that within the church, the deacons serve a very important function, the same way an elder serves a very important function. But the elders are over the local congregation. And is it possible for a member, for a man to go straight to being an elder without being a deacon? Yeah, it's possible, assuming they meet the qualifications. In the same way that it's possible for a man to be a deacon for 20 or 30 years. He doesn't necessarily meet the qualifications for being an elder, but he meets the qualifications for being a deacon. So any questions on that particular part, be it the qualifications or the attitude or that leadership pipeline that we have somehow developed? Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And it's a subjective one. There's a lot of overlap. Theoretically, they're already serving. And it's one of those situations where a lot of times we do pull our elders from our deacons, but it's not a requirement. It's just a good idea, right? So it's just like how we were talking about, biblically, the minister appoints the elders, right? And so there's not any book, chapter, and verse that the minister has to poll the congregation or, submit forms or anything like that. There's no book, chapter, and verse on that. You won't find it, right? But as a matter of expediency and practicality and just good common sense, it's a good idea to do. And so that's one of those situations where, is it required to be a deacon before being an elder? No. But is it a good idea? Yeah, probably. So from the job just because they didn't serve as a deacon. So, all right. Any others? Yes, ma'am. Can a minister be an elder? Great question. Yes, no, maybe so. What do you think? Can a minister be an elder? Yes. It's a lot of work. All right. All right. So this is okay. The elders functioned in the role of a minister or preacher in the local congregation, right? So the thing to keep in mind is that the idea of a paid located preacher, it existed in the first century. But like Paul or Timothy stays somewhere for a couple of years and then they leave, right? Well, there's no guarantee that there's going to be another preacher show up, right? They didn't have so then someone has to step in and fill that role. And who should step in and fill that role? Well, probably the spiritual leaders, right? That's, I think, one of the reasons why apt to teach is a requirement. It doesn't mean, it's not limited to classroom teaching or instruction, but it definitely, I think when the need arises, you step up. And so, yeah, there's no elder, right? Peter is a preacher. He's also an apostle and a fellow elder. So we do have that biblical example. Where the issue comes into play is, will we pay the minister and the elder, and he's an elder, so it kind of seems like, well, double work, we'll come, how does that conversation go? Well, Minister so-and-so, do you think you should get a raise? As a matter of fact, Elder me, I think I should. Right? And so it's one of those situations, and it's a lot of work, right? Elder is a lot of work, minister is a lot of work. You put them together. And so here's a couple of things. Like here's where I've seen it happen very well. I've seen it happen very well in a situation where the minister elder person is more of a retired, like they don't need the money. And so, they go, okay, in that scenario. I've also seen it work in a scenario where you have a plurality of elders of, say, 3, 4, 5, something like that, and the minister recuses themselves from that discussion, right? It's like when we get to talking about salary or anything like that, and I do the same thing here. I'm not an elder, but we have men's meetings, right? And so whenever that topic comes up, I recuse myself from the discussion, right? I don't have a vote. I have an opinion. I don't have a vote. And so, Mark, what'd you have? Yeah. And so there's an old joke that the preacher is doing the elder's job, the elder's doing the deacon's job, and nobody knows what the deacons are doing. And it's an old joke, but it's also very indicative of what we have come to expect of the minister and the preacher. So in the denominational world, you have the role of pastoralship, right? A pastor, right? And the pastor functions as the spiritual guide for the congregation. They also do the preaching in most of those situations. And in the scriptures, that's the job of the elder. The elders are the spiritual guide of the congregation. And so what has happened over time is we have overlapped the role of preacher with elder, and so we associate the spiritual guidance and care of the congregation with the preacher, right? Someone is sick and in the hospital. Who do we call? The preacher. But who does James say to call? Right? At some point, we miss the mark, right? Now, does that mean? But when that becomes the expectation, we've missed the mark, and a lot of that is bleed over from the denominational world who sees the pastor in that way, and that's how we have discussions sometimes about things, and it's like, well, I understand that people may think that's what the preacher should do, but that doesn't mean that's what the preacher should do, right? Another thing is like visitation. Whose job is visitation? The preacher. Is it though? It's the congregation in that scenario, right? The scripture tells us that they were all meeting from house to house, right? So there are several things like that where we have allowed for external factors to influence it. Also, the opinion, back in the day, early 19, people were dirt floor poor, right? We didn't have money for nothing, right? The preacher was also a farmer or school teacher or whatever, and everybody else was a farmer or factory worker or whatever, right? And so we ain't gonna pay somebody to do something we could go do ourselves, right? And so, but in the 1950s, after the war boom, right, we see the rise of what's called the professional preacher, right? That's when we start seeing the requirements of a 4-year college degree and things like that. And because the congregations were less, factory workers and farmers and those kinds of things, and they became more office workers and business people. And now there's always been some, but it became more of the demographic. And as that happened, then we see the outsourcing of responsibilities. Well, we're paying a preacher. Let's just let him do it, right? We're paying him so that he can be available to go do it. And what happens sometimes is that, and so then it becomes the preacher's job. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into that. But yeah, so ultimately, back to the fundamental question, can a preacher be an elder? Yes, he can. It is very hard. I can count on 2 hands the number of men I know who did it well. Probably 1 hand, really. So, but that's a good question. That's a good question. You also have to be careful that the minister elder doesn't become a controlling elder or a ruling elder, because that's one of the big things, especially in churches of Christ, but in congregations, is, the elders are sometimes seen as like the committee chair or the board of directors, right? They make decisions, but they're very often decisions made in a back room, and they only ever get up to talk when something bad happened, right? Unfortunately, that's the default a lot of times, right? That's why we were talking last week about the importance of being a shepherd elder. But the preacher is up in front of everybody most times week in and week out. And so we just see people doing the speaking and doing the out there peopling, and we draw an attachment or an affinity for that person. And so, in some regards, that person becomes the person that we latch on to. And that, again, can be problematic, because when you attach that affinity to an elder in that way, then that person can have an unequal amount of influence. And so there's a lot of variables at play there. All right. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, it is 100%. Well, in reality, the elders should model the behavior they expect to see out of the congregation. And the congregation should understand that the elders are modeling the behavior they expect, right? So that's where it kind of goes the thing. Lisa? Mm-hmm. It is not common, um, but it is also not wrong. Um, because the premise, because here's the thing, right? The premise is that a laborer deserves their wage, right? And of a congregation in Marion, who had an elder who had a sufficient amount. He was a younger man, as an elder goes, like he's 50s, and he great elder. I'm gonna see him this week, actually, looking forward to it. Who had the free time, and so they hired him to be they wanted to compensate him for going above and beyond, and so the office elder, but like he would they paid him so that he, as an elder, would be able to be free and flexible to go during the middle of the day to visit somebody or to do some of these things. And there's nothing biblically wrong with that. But just like with a preacher, there are some potential problematic things with that. Mark? Why would it? So that's making the assumption that if someone does something for money, that then they don't do it for sincerity or dedication. So am I teaching for money, Mark? It's still serving for money. It's still trading your time for money. It is what it is. And so, like, what makes something a. All right. But does that mean that I can't be sincere about my profession? Are you not sincere about your profession? All right. So, Tommy. Yeah. All right, fair enough. We'll put a pin in that, Sarah. Yeah. That, yeah, so now that, but that's different than negotiations, right? I mean, I could see, but what about if there's a need? There's maybe not somebody doing it, but it's somebody who's serving, say an elder, right? And they know elder so and so's got the free time, and this is a need we have filled that's maybe traditionally been a paid, or maybe they want to start it as paid, right? So they could then go and say, "Hey, elder so and so, would you be interested to do this?" And we'll throw a little something, something your way. Eric? Well, because it's God's money. Um, so, well, so the stewardship of the money, huh? No, no. I am a leader, but so in a biblically in a congregation that is has elders. The Well, I do. I think all Christians should. So, but yeah, no, I got you, Eric. So, because great question. Okay, let's go over to 1 Corinthians 9. Let's go. All right. All right. Okay. We're going to go to 1 Corinthians 9. All right. Here we go. Verse 1. Am I not free, brother? Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen our Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? All right, so let's pause right there. All right, so the context of this is that there were individuals who had come to the church at Corinth, for whom the church, who they were theoretically ministering to, right? They were laboring and preaching and teaching. And they were doing so at the expense of the congregation, right? And so Paul asks the question, do we not have a right to eat and drink? I.e., do we also not have the right to, be compensated for the work that we do? Well, that's his question, right? Because apparently there was somebody, just Paul, the bare minimum to exist. We'll give him bread and water. Well, don't we have the right to take along a believing wife, as do other apostles and brothers of the Lord and Cephas? And so it seems very clear that there were more than just the apostles going around preaching, and those individuals were being compensated for the work they did, and it was a sufficient compensation to take care of at least their wife, potentially their family, right? So that is the context. And then he goes on and he's a little tongue-in-cheek here. Is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Right? The logic being, if you work for somebody, it makes sense that you get paid. I understand that. We do. And so there is, and we'll go. All right. Let's finish this and then we'll pick up with it. All right. The thoughts on it. It says, do I say on these human authorities, does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim, do not we even more? Right? So fundamentally, the laborer deserves the wage. Now, to Eric's point, but aren't we all laborers? Right? So, all right. Don't all Christians serve? Yeah, all Christians are supposed to serve. So, supposed to, right? But we'll operate under the assumption that they are, all right, for the purposes of this discussion, right? There is a role within a local congregation of being a minister, a preacher, an evangelist, or a teacher, right? They are the minister. They're the same people, right? Four words for the same person. A minister is someone who takes care of the needs of the congregation. The preacher is a herald of divine truth. The evangelist is more of a proclaimer of the gospel, specifically towards those who do not know the gospel. And a teacher is simply one who communicates the word of God, okay? There is a degree that all Christians are teachers. There is a degree to which all Christians are servants. There is a degree to which all Christians are ministers and evangelists, right? Those are all the things. But it, from the very earliest times, was recognized that there was a role of someone who does that above and beyond, more so than the average Christian. Someone who takes on the responsibility of teaching and preaching, and someone who takes on the responsibility of being evangelist, and somebody who does all of those things. And that person is, and I'm going to use this word, eligible for compensation when they do such a thing. And that's what Paul is getting at here. That if somebody labors in preaching and teaching, they are eligible for compensation. All right? In 1 Timothy 5, right, he says, verse 17, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. So not all elders were laboring in preaching and teaching. There were some who were. And why? Why should we give double honor to the ones, especially the ones who are laboring, preaching, and teaching? For the scripture says, your deserves his wages. So again, it seems in the early church there were some elders who were laboring and preaching and teaching, and some elders who were receiving pay. All right? So there is a first century biblical precedent that you can compensate a man for laboring and preaching and teaching. Correct. Sure. Sure. And if you can help it, and and ve- it could. No. So but let's shift gears out of the eldership and just talk about ministers, because 97% of congregations don't have paid elderships. Most have paid ministers, right? And so like Belafont and I were paid ministers, and it's like, well, shouldn't we be doing, should we be doing it for free? I mean, that's a choice. Like, but there's nothing wrong with paying us. And you say, well, okay, and but you say, the reality is that you look at a number on, it doesn't translate into um, what goes into the stuff, right? So I teach classes, right? I teach classes. I think I do a decent job teaching classes. That's not fishing for a compliment. That's just a statement of fact, right? And everybody goes, Matt, how do you teach such good classes? Well, I'm glad you asked. I spent 8 years studying in depth, ad nauseum. I went into 6 figures of student loan debt that I still have and will probably have until the day I die. And then every week I thankfully know where we're going from one week to the next. I spend hours preparing, right? And so you may see a 30-minute lesson, but there's years of preparation and hours in the last, well, preacher only preaches on Sunday. Well, you're seeing the culmination of hours of work on my part or Belafont's part, right? And so then it becomes, okay, so how much do we compensate, right? It's the same thing like if I, go to a company and, fix a computer system or something for them, right? I can fix that problem in about 15 minutes. I'm going to charge you $150. Well, why in the world could you charge me $150? Well, because I've been doing this for over 20 years and I'm able to do it in 30 minutes. If you want me to take 4 hours to make you feel better about it, I will, right? But that's the thing, right? Eric. Is mammon money? No, not necessarily. Yeah. So, well, mammon can mean money in some context. Yeah. So, in that context, one can't serve God and money. Yes. In that context, yes. Yeah. And so, but it's not serving God to pay your light bill, or not serving money to pay your light bill, huh? Sure. So fair, right? I got you. So it. I will go ahead and tell you, if you get, this is no comment on the generosity of the congregation, but if you get paid to preach, you are not rolling up in a Benz. Like, that just doesn't happen, right? Like, you'll be rolling up in a Honda Accord and a Hyundai Sonata. So no, you're fine. These are good questions to ask. Let's go to Greg, then Belafont. Yeah. Uh-huh. This doesn't seem like a realistic hypothetical, Greg. I agree. We should pay Belafont more. Belafont.
told me because I was starting in a certain position, I get $1 more than what they bring the regular position. I said, cool. I got that. 2 years later, I realized I wasn't getting paid that extra $1. So I took it to them and I talked to them about it. And they said, well, you should have brought it up sooner. I go, cool. The union called me and said, hey, we can get you that $1. And I said, don't worry about it. It'll be okay. I'm cool. So years later, God blessed me with money in other ways. Because I wasn't going to, it didn't make sense to fight over $1. I mean, I was being blessed with a check every week and the benefits we get. So my thinking was, when you add the benefits in, God has already blessed me. I'm not going to squabble over $1. These are the pitfalls that Satan wants us to fall into to fight. And that's selfishness. That becomes selfishness.
I don't agree. I don't agree. I know, and it doesn't make it wrong because we disagree.
We need to walk in the spirit of the Lord. We need to rely on God.
Sure.
Not ourselves.
Sure.
When we start relying on ourselves, at least for me, when I start relying on myself, I get selfish. And that's what I'm trying not to. I don't want to be selfish because selfishness is not love.
That's fair. I would say advocating for what is right is not selfishness. That is, but there would be nothing wrong with there's been a clerical error on my stub, right? I had it happen, right? I had it happen where I didn't get holiday pay because there was a clerical error. And I went to our people. I said, hey, there was a clerical error on my, and they corrected it. I wasn't wrong for asking for it because the fundamental principle is that if you do the work, you get the pay, right? You go back to the parable, right, of the laborers that Jesus talks about, right? He hires some at the morning, he hires some at the midday, and some at the afternoon, right before closing time, right? They all get paid the same, right? And they started bickering about it, right? And that wasn't right. But they all worked what they or were paid and worked what they were agreed to, right? And so there it is a biblical premise that whatever the agreement is, you whatever the work you do, you should get paid for it. Now the debate and the squabble within the church is, well, what should that pay be? Well, let's pause that because we're going to run out of time today. To Eric's question or situation, you had a problem within the early church of people who just quit working in order, they just, well, God's going to take care of it, right? And then what did they end up doing? They ended up coming to the church and saying, I ain't got no food. And that's a problem because the premise of the New Testament is if you can work, do work, right? Right. But if you can't work or in a position where you couldn't, right? For example, and we see this, I think, a decent amount, is if the options are lose my house or food, get food, pay your rent and come to the food pantry, right? That's what it's there for, right? But listen, here's the reality, though. Here's the reality. There are some people who are on fixed incomes or who are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week and cannot make ends meet. That is the reality of it. So all right. So,
Because this world is complete mammon and it's killing us all, I think.
well,
We're talking about eternity either at all.
let's back it up a second, okay? So, the actual verse that we're all referring is no man can serve two masters. He can either serve God or money. You can make money without it being a master, okay? That is possible, right? It is when you play, huh?
Legally, all the people with apples and oranges today.
Nobody's calling you a thief here. I didn't say that. Those words never came out of my mouth.
What the Bible is telling me that
When
providing all the apples and oranges to us for free. Are we going to live that life? Or are we going to, open up to something different?
it does not say that God provided, it says He created them.
I will read it right now. Will you let me?
Sure.
Okay, let me find it.
So,
The earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree planted, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed within itself after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Let me keep going.
so you keep looking, but what you,
What I've read, that if I'm here, I have money in my pocket, and I can go live on my own and serve money.
so, all right.
I don't think, and I'll pastor for the money.
He-
I'll pastor for free. I've had thoughts of waiting for you and sitting at home going, I will pastor, and I've put my effort in, and I want to believe that you're here to serve, and I'm here to serve. But it seems like you have jobs that you have mammon work at, and you take put time into that. But I'm looking for that effort where, service is one thing, not both.
All right. So let's
We're here debating money at all.
let's back it up a second. So in Genesis chapter 3, which is after the fall, all right? Genesis chapter 3 after the fall. All right, God says to Adam, okay? Verse 17. And to Adam, you want to turn there and you can read with me. Okay? Genesis chapter 3. That's fine. Here. Yeah, I'll pull out the King James so we're reading it same together so there's no different words. All right. 1 second. Apps run a little slow. I never run out of battery on my printed one. So, all right. So here we go. All right. We are in Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, King James. All right. And there. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also, thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thy return unto the ground. For out of it thou wast taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou wilt return. And so verse 19 is saying, from the sweat of your brow, you will eat from the ground. You will eat what you work to grow. Okay, what you work for. So if you plant a garden, you get all the benefits. Well, here's the thing. Well, it is talking about earthly food in that scenario. Earthly food, physical, material food. No, it's talking about any food anywhere in the world that is on the earth. Eden is God's creation, yes. All right, Eden is a location. It is a place, a physical place. Yes, but creation is not Eden. Eden is a small little part. It's like saying Cleveland. God created the world. God created earth, and within a small part of earth, he made Eden. Yes.
I'm saying earth is that round ball has four quarters.
You're getting too into the weeds, Eric. Okay. Well, we will end on that. The principle is from Genesis and Corinthians. A laborer deserves the wage. Whether that laborer is gardening, the sweat of their brow, or laboring in the ministry of the church, in that instance, trading time for money, right? It is also a biblical principle that you don't have to take money. If we kept reading in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul would say, but guess what? I didn't do that. So, because very frequently Paul worked as a tent maker and provided for his needs. So it's an option, not a requirement. All right, we will pause and pick up there next time.
I'll find that free passage. Could see my life that legally we're not free.
So here's the thing, okay? Answer me this question. In laws change. Can the rules change?
In my book or the court?
In God's can God change the rules? Sure.
Why? Why would you change a rule? If it's supposed to be this, and then he changes it, why would you do that?
Because they. So for example, let's say you've got nobody lives in that room, right? And so they post the speed limit